What we're going to do in this video is revise key themes that come across all 4 of the units. So things that will come up in politics and participation, life in modern Britain, rights and responsibilities, and active citizenship. And the way we're going to do it is look through the theme of British values. So our 4 British values are democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual tolerance and respect. And we're going to look at these British values and see how they can help us revise citizenship. So we'll start with democracy because democracy is the overriding factor in each of the units. So democracy is a system of government by the entire population or a majority of eligible citizens, usually through elected representatives. It basically means that you have got freedoms. It means that people are in power. So we live in a democracy, and there's lots of things we can do in a democracy that you can't in a non-democratic country, such as the dictatorship, somewhere like North Korea. So we enjoy a lot of freedoms. We've got a liberal democracy, which means that it's linked to freedoms and rights. A direct democracy is where all citizens take part in decision making. So this is when we have referendums, when it's not just the MPs and the Lords who are deciding on new policies and laws, when we all get a vote. That is really difficult to maintain. It costs a lot of money, a lot of time. So we live in what's called a representative democracy. And this is where MPs represent the people in Parliament to discuss how the country should be run, or your local councils represent you in local councils. So a democracy is where the entire population or majority of people vote and elect representatives, and we can do these things. We have regular and fair elections where they are not fraudulently done, where people can vote in freedom without fear of reprisal. An electoral system where there's a secret ballot and where the results do reflect the views of the public. There are regular elections, so the government are accountable. For example, in this country, we have a general election at the most every 5 years. Any citizen can stand for election. That's really important that you could put yourself forward. You guys could be MPs in the future. So it's really important that you're not born into that position, that you actually can get into that position of power. Candidates can campaign equally without intimidation or bribery, and the really important part is that the media are free to report on the work of government. They can hold the government to account. The judiciary is also separate from the government, so citizens can use the legal process to hold the government to account, i.e. what happened when Gina Miller took the government to court, to the UK Supreme Court, over the prorogation of Parliament. So we also have values that underpin democracy. These values are really important. So this is what's important to us, the reason why we have a democracy. The first thing is rights. So our human rights. In a democracy, you have your rights met. You have legal rights, social and ethical rights, and you have got these human rights that you do not have to the same extent in non-democratic countries. We've got our Human Rights Act, and our human rights are enforced by law. So that's mainly the most important thing to do with why we have a democracy. We also have responsibilities, and these are equally as important. These are our duties as citizens of society. So because we have our rights, the kind of, I wouldn't say the payment, but the payoff for that is that we have these responsibilities. So for example, we have to pay taxes. We have all these things given to us by law. So we have to pay our taxes to ensure they're able to be there. We also have to obey the law. We've got a fair and just legal system. It's only fair that we obey the laws and the rules of society. We might be called to act on jury service, and we'll talk about that later. You also might have to have conscription if there's a war, but hopefully that would never happen. They're not optional, and they are underpinned by law. If you don't pay your taxes, you go to court. If you don't do your jury service without good cause, you get fined, and so on. We also have freedoms, so we are able to act, speak or think as we want. So we have the freedom of choice, freedom of the press and freedom of movement, which means that we can move around countries. Our freedom of choice means that, for example, if we want to express ourselves as somebody of the opposite sex, so if you were born into a man's body but later on you feel like you want to express yourself as a female, you are able to do that in this country because we are a democracy, because we have those freedoms. You are free to support what political party you want, to be what religion you want, and so on. And again, these are core values underpinning our democracy. We've also got the rule of law, and we'll talk about that later, but it means you've got to obey the law no matter who you are, and you will be treated the same by the legal system. All of this is underpinned by equality, and that's another key part of our democracy. So everybody should face equal treatment, and there's lots of legislation in there that backs this up, the most important being the Equality Act of 2010. So if we look at democracy in a bit more detail, we've got votes in this country. You're allowed to vote for who you want to run the country. But is our voting system democratic enough? Shouldn't we have votes at 16? Wouldn't that make it far more fairer? You guys at your age, whoever comes into government next is going to have far more of an impact on you than it would on me. You guys have still got to get your qualifications, you've got to get your first job, buy a house, raise your children, all those key things that will be determined by who's in government. So surely it's far more important that 16-year-olds vote, especially as the current voter turnout for 18 to 24-year-olds is still so low, under 50%. Maybe if you voted at 16, when you get into the habit, because you've learnt it at school and you do mock votes and things at school, that you'll learn that voting habit and it will carry on, which will then make society far more democratic and representative. How about allowing prisoners to vote? They're part of society too. Wouldn't it make them more part of society if they could have a say in how the country's run? How about electronic voting, voting via the internet? Wouldn't that make people far more able to vote and actually willing to vote? But then there's the issue with the fact of that they could be hacked. How about changing the voting system? Our current first past the post means that really it's only a battle between Conservatives and Labour. If we changed it to proportional representation, where every single vote counts, then that means that people would be much more likely to vote, because if they wanted one of the smaller parties to vote to get into Parliament, they might be more willing to vote if they think there's actually a chance of them doing it. Should voting be compulsory? Should we make it that if you don't vote that you get fined? They have something similar to this in Australia. Is that actually democratic though? By forcing people to vote, aren't we taking away their freedoms? Would it make it more difficult for those who've got, say, mobility issues, who might not be able to get to a polling station? Would it make it that it would put people off because you're telling them what they should be doing? Or would everybody's vote be represented so it's actually more fair? Should you be made to take a test before you're allowed to vote? Voting is a huge responsibility. It's one of the responsibilities that underpins a democracy. By making people take a citizenship test before they vote, it proves that they know what they're talking about, that they're not just voting for the sake of it, and that actually they've got an understanding of what they want from our democracy. But would it put people off? Nobody wants to take tests. And is it really excluding people who perhaps haven't got the academic ability to complete a test? What happens if we don't vote? Is that really fair? Is it that if we don't vote, we are therefore not represented and we don't get a say in a democracy? So another part about being in democracy is being able to make a change. One way we can do this is petitions. Remember, if an online petition gets 100,000 signatures, it should be debated in Parliament. Sometimes it's debated in Parliament and they don't ever pay attention to it. Sometimes they refuse to debate it in Parliament, like the call to revoke Article 50 about Brexit. It didn't get discussed, even though there were 6 million votes. Sometimes it will get get brought up in Parliament and laws do get changed as a result. E.g. when Marcus Rashford campaigned about extending the free school dinners over lockdown, that got over 100,000 signatures, that petition did, it got debated and the policies got changed. Lobbying is when you campaign to your MP, so you write to them, you email them, you see them at their offices, or you go down to the House of Parliament and you talk to them and try and get them on your side. You could stand for election yourself. That's the great thing about a democracy. You can put yourself in those positions of power. If you don't get voted in now, you might have wasted your time. Voting, of course. Pressure groups and community action. These can be absolutely brilliant. If you think about the pressure groups, like going back to the suffragettes, they made huge changes. You've got pressure groups on the free school meals who made changes. There's lots and lots of pressure groups that haven't. So people like Fathers for Justice with their direct action weren't quite as successful. But pressure groups who campaigned for, say, gay marriage or for fox hunting to be banned have all been successful. Work within the community, your local community action. Remember Rebecca Hoskins and her plastic bags campaign? So her in her local village, she asked the local villagers not to use plastic bags just to see if they could try and save some of their local wildlife. All of the shops agreed and this spread, so it went from her little village, her little community, to the whole of the UK, and now plastic bags aren't given out freely, you have to pay for them. That was really successful. One that's been partly successful in the community is the Westmill Solar and Wind Farm. They're a local community who campaigned to have wind turbines and solar panels installed, and it grew so that 4,000 people in the village are now reliant 100% on renewable energy, which is absolutely brilliant for their local community. However, it didn't spread to the rest of the UK. So, if we look at our legal systems, this now goes between democracy and the British value of the rule of law. In our legal system, we have free and fair trials. They are open to the public. If you went to a non-democratic country, you would never be allowed to have members of the public sitting on trials like we did when we went to Wolverhampton courts. In our legal system, we have magistrates and juries who are members of the public. They are random members of the public in a jury or volunteers in a magistrate's. They decide on the verdict in cases. So magistrates in a magistrate's court will decide the verdict and the sanction. In a Crown Court, where the serious criminal cases are, the jury, the 12 random members of the public, will decide the verdict. So if a person is guilty or not. This is brilliant because they have an everyday understanding of what life in Britain is like. Judges tend to be from middle or upper class backgrounds. They tend to be male, white and over a certain age. So they usually have lived their life in quite a restricted upbringing where they don't really understand what it's like to live in the middle of Sedgley or somewhere like that. So juries can have a wide range of opinions, an everyday understanding. It's really, really democratic. It is giving people power in our legal system. However, they might not understand all of the technical terms and the judge has to keep stopping and explaining things. They could also have their own biases. What if they don't like black people and the person on trial is black? They could also be bribed or even blackmailed into voting one way or the other. Going more into our rule of law and again in our democracy, we've got a separation of powers in this country, which is brilliant. So our judiciary, our system of courts and judges are completely separate to our executive and our legislator. Our judiciary, who are our judges, make judgments on the law. Our executive, who are our government, they're the ones who put law into action, and our legislature is the whole of Parliament, the House of Commons, the House of Lords and the Queen, and they're the ones who make the laws. So our judiciary are totally separate, which is really democratic. The judges in the UK Supreme Court are experts in law. They are the top judges in the country. They've got there by merit and they can't be members of the House of Lords, although they used to be up until the Reformation. They are politically neutral. They are allowed to hold the government to account, which they absolutely did in things like the prorogation of Parliament law case, where Gina Miller took the government to court. If the judiciary were part of the legislature or part of the executive, they would never be able to do that. They'd be under constant scrutiny and constant pressure from the MPs, from the Lords, to judge certain ways in cases, but they are separate. Our executive or our government are the ones who put the law into action. So when you see Boris Johnson announcing the new COVID rules, that's what they're doing. Our legislature is the whole of Parliament, the House of Commons, the House of Lords and the monarch. These are the ones who make the laws. You could argue it's brilliant that they're the ones who make the laws because of this separation of power. They also have to go through lots and lots of checks. So if you remember, the Green Paper's announced, it gets debated, then the White Paper, it bounces back between the House of Commons and the House of Lords before it goes to the monarch. So there's over 1,000 people who are deciding on making a law. And also remember that MPs are elected and we are in a democracy, so it's really important these are the ones making laws because they are the ones who represent us. And remember that a House of Commons can pass through a law even if the House of Lords disagree, because we're a democracy and they're the elected ones. However, they are not experts in law like judges are, so there is an argument there that perhaps judges should be the ones making the laws up. So how our British values are established then. We've spoken about democracy and rule of law, but individual liberty and mutual tolerance and respect. Parliament has passed loads of laws to support these. The Equality Act of 2010 is really important. It means that the 9 protected characteristics such as gender, ethnicity, age, disability, trans status, marital status and so on are protected by law. So if you are discriminated against, it is against the law and you will be taken to court. We've also got the Human Rights Act of 1998, and that puts all of our human rights into the legal system. Therefore, if somebody violates your human rights, they go to court. We also have got the fact that our legislative process makes sure that over 1,000 people are involved in passing laws and that Parliament is there to scrutinise the work of government. So, for example, Boris Johnson can't just pass a law without it going through Parliament. Even when he makes these decisions on what we're going to do with COVID changes, it still has to go through Parliament. And how do our British values transfer into the global world then? So our human rights legislation actually comes from global legislation. So we got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights made in 1948, post World War II. That then fed down to the European Convention of Human Rights made in 1950, which led to our Human Rights Act of 1998. On top of that, you've got the Universal Declaration on the Rights of the Child, which was made by the UN in 1990. The ECHR came from the European Council that was made in 1950, and our HR, our Human Rights Act, in 1998. We've also got world court, so our court system feeds into that. So if we feel that somebody is committing war crimes, we would take them to the International Criminal Court, which is a criminal court that covers the whole world. The International Court of Justice is the civil court for the whole of the world, and that would be about trade disputes, unfair trade, and those kind of things. We've also part of lots of international organisations like the UN, NATO, the Commonwealth, World Trade Organisations, the EU and so on. Although we're not part of the EU anymore, you do need to know positives and limitations of being part of each of those organisations. The other thing that we can do is we can help in international conflict. So that might be through mediation, getting 2 sides to sit down and talk and work out a deal like the Good Friday Agreement with Ireland. It might be use of sanctions, so usually stopping trade with countries if they are doing things we disagree with. Or it could be use of force, which is where you send the military in, which is like what we have done in Iraq and Syria. Another thing that we signed up to is international humanitarian law, and these are the rules for wartime. So you cannot attack civilians, you cannot attack injured soldiers, you cannot kill prisoners of war. These are all about maintaining human rights, about preserving life, and about trying to promote peace. We also have many NGOs that are based in the UK, and we support them. Our government gives them money. So things like Oxfam, things like Save the Children, things like the Red Cross, these can provide aid in times of crisis. So if there's been a drought, an earthquake, if there's been a war, if there has been famine, and these NGOs will go in as a charity and provide things like food, shelter, water, medication, and they also, as most of them are pressure groups, might apply pressure to the governments to try and help the people.